So welcome everybody to this event on what is food and who decides, focused on milk and meat. This event is sponsored by the Robert F. and Jean E. Holtz Center for Science and Technology Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm not going to tell you too much about what we do, except that this is the best thing that we do. It gives us a chance to bring folks from the university, from different parts of the university, out into places where they don't normally get to talk about their work with people who don't always get to hear about their work, to talk about how science and technology affect society and vice versa. This particular event is sort of a spin-off of something called the Go Big Read program. So you may have heard about this, but basically every year at the university picks one book for everyone to read. Not everyone reads it, of course. But the university encourages people to read it and to use it in their classes. And when we can, we try to nudge the university to include something which has a science or technology angle in it, especially something that gets at the social implications of science and technology. And so this particular book is Deborah Blum's book, The Poison Squad, and it's about food safety and the origins of the FDA. And there was so much we could talk about. There were so many people who were excited to talk about it from our campus. That we're very glad to be here, and we're very grateful. Come on in. Hold the chairs. And we're complete. So good intros, no worries. And apologies also for your name being wrong. I will briefly introduce our speakers to let you know sort of where they fit into the big university picture. And then they'll get a chance to tell you a little bit about how their work speaks to this question of what counts as milk and what counts as meat, and why that might not be such an obvious question, at least in the sort of legal technical senses, and how that filters out into our lives. So down at the end, we have Steph Tai, who's a professor at the UW-Madison Law School. She specializes in environmental and administrative law, food systems law, and risk regulation law, and teaches a gripping course on advanced contracts. Monica, how do I pronounce your last name?
Tice.
Tice. It's Monica Tice is a distinguished lecturer in the Department of Food Science, a registered dietitian and nutritionist specializing in food service operations, and food systems management. We have Jeff Sindelar, who is an associate professor and extension meat specialist in the Department of Animal Sciences. He's an expert in meat science, processing, and food safety. And we have Scott, not Steve Rankin, despite advertisement to the contrary, who's professor and chair of the Food Science Department, who studies food manufacturing, including pasteurization, dairy chemistry, ice cream, and cheese grating. So thank you all for coming, and if you could join me briefly in welcoming and to start with, why don't you all Steph, could we start with you?
Sure.
And then I'll just ask you to say a little bit about how your work speaks to this topic. And then we'll be open for conversation and questions.
I teach and write in areas of environmental law and food law, and also advanced contracts and administrative law. And so I'm interested in the food law side, how agencies sort of regulate different aspects of the food system. And most recently, I've worked on a paper that's coming out in the spring on how state legislatures and the federal government is attempting to constrain the sort of definition of meat. That is, restricting the use of the term meat either to only livestock-based products or, as in Wisconsin, livestock and insect-based products, interestingly enough, and also how many different states are doing so. So I explore that. I explore sort of different kinds of aspects going on in the federal government, and I can talk about that in question and answer. And I also explore how how the sort of underlying dynamics of First Amendment challenges can play a role in this, because there's also speech rights on the part of actual producers, both including sort of plant-based meat substitutes and also sort of cell cultured and potentially insect-based substitutes. And so I explore the intersection of some First Amendment laws, some of the sort of state laws, and federal laws, and then also talk about the history of the use of the term meat, either in vegetarian-based communities or other communities. And then, so I'm happy to talk about all of those. Thank you.
My name is Monica, and I'm with the Department of Food Science. My interest in this is from several perspectives. I teach a number of courses in the Department of Food Science, one being food law for our undergraduates in the Department of Food Science. So this is simply a particular interest to me from my teaching responsibilities. A different interest, and a little bit more compelling and interesting from my perspective, I think, is I'm very interested in consumer perception of terms. Like there's the legal definitions, but then what do consumers think and want in terms of food labeling? And just, that's something that's very interesting to me, so that's what brings me to the table.
Great. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jeff Sindlar. As Noah mentioned, I'm an associate professor and extension meat specialist. I've been in Madison, University of Wisconsin-Madison for over 12 and a half years now. So most of my job is extension, and then the smaller part is research. I usually drill down to, in layman's terms, the reason that I exist at the University of Wisconsin is to support the viability and growth of the meat industry in the state of Wisconsin. So that includes small, medium, and large establishments, as well as support groups, so companies that supply, make ingredients, spices, casings, do microbiology testing, and so forth. On the research side, I try to address questions that are pertinent to the state of Wisconsin, kind of through the meat industry, that are questions that need to have faster responses. So I do a multitude of different projects. I work a lot with youth and consumers, addressing concerns and questions, and use at absolute all costs science-based information to disseminate information, address questions, recognizing that everyone has an opinion, and when I'm addressing questions or concerns, I try to have the perception to recognize that, take my opinion, put it to the side, and then use science, realizing that that whatever the science says is what needs to be conveyed. I work a lot with questions about food safety, human safety, whether it be the latest study on meat causes cancer, or what the impact meat has on diet or health. I've done a lot of work with nitrates, both on the research as well as the communication. I've got a couple of publications talking about the benefits of nitrite, as well as the technology of use, and just kind of an all-around, what is the important significance of meat, in this case, for supplying human health and substance for nourishment, and addressing the growing population. So kind of an all-around player, expert, maybe. Definitely have comments most times. So hopefully valuable all the time.
Hi, and good evening, everybody. My name is Scott Rankin. I'm a professor and chair of the Food Science Department at UW-Madison. I've been there a little over 18 years. My work is primarily in dairy foods processing. So my appointment is not unlike Jeff's, in that I'm primarily extension outreach. And so I teach, so Jeff teaches to and interacts with the meat industry. I interact with the dairy foods manufacturing industry. So from pasteurizing milk, making ice cream. I just left an ice cream course today, and so that's why I was late. No, wasn't I was late, but anyway. So I do a lot of programming in all things dairy foods manufacturing. So I also serve as expert witness quite a bit. I get more requests than I have really bandwidth to do so. Those who have not done well in the contracts course, I think I end up offering opinion on various issues relative to dairy foods, litigation involving dairy foods. So that's kind of my background.
So before opening it up, I wonder if I could ask you each, is there anything about the work that you're doing right now that a few years ago you would not have expected? something surprising that pertains to this question of what counts as milk in particular?
I guess we'll get started. So a couple of years ago, there weren't the rise of all of these state laws sort of prescribing how meat is to be defined. There are some sort of standards of identity under the FDA kind of regulations, mostly for sort of demonstrating purity and fraud. However, these sort of state laws, I didn't really expect them that much. And part of it is because plant-based foods or plant-based meat substitutes have existed for quite some time and have been called things like vegetarian meat, vegetarian duck, blah, blah, blah. And there wasn't this kind of sense that there needed to be any kind of regulations. Now with the sort of new wave of products, as I think of it, as they're actually targeted towards more of not just a primary vegetarian consuming audience, but more sort of part-time, right, vegetarians, or people who are just looking into exploring. And I think that's generated some of these laws and sort of generates some of the discussions. Same thing goes for like sort of nut-based and sort of all these different milk products, right? Soy milks have existed in my world. Like my family's from Hong Kong and we've had soy milks like since they were growing up. But labeling it was never really a concern until much more recently when they weren't trying to sort of pull off pure vegans, but rather just the average, sometimes dairy consuming, populace into sometimes having these kinds of things. And so that's where both the sort of generation, I think, for these laws have come about, and also maybe the impetus for some of these laws. So that surprised me.
From my perspective, there's a couple of things that have really surprised me. It's not so much the topics as much as how quickly they sort of exploded, as Steph is saying. The emphasis on state regulation with defining things like meat and milks and things like that. So that's been a surprise, and that certainly had an impact. The other thing is the emphasis, and in less than a year, the explosion of interest from a regulatory perspective on bugs and insects, and how that has really taken off. So that did surprise me. I think, again, I'm really interested in the consumer perspective kinds of things and what really drives change. And I think the thing in the last year that's really interested me, I'm not sure I'm surprised by it, but the consumer force behind the idea of environmental impact rather than nutrition. Because as I'm a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and so much of the previous marketing on various foods was from the health and nutrition perspective. I think the emphasis on environmental impact, might be having more of a impact in terms of how consumers are spending their dollar. I'm not sure, but it's something that I think might be happening.
Yeah, I think those are great comments that really apply to the meat side of things. So flexitarians are interested in both, but there's also companies today that their market, like Impossible Burger, is not for the flexitarians. It is for meat eaters. They want conversion. So there's very in the past few years, couple of years, there's been very specific not motives but agendas, right? This is what we want to do. In the past, it's been a little bit more, not quite as hard. There's also a lot of support, both from the last few years, it's always been, but definitely in some of these more environmentally driven, socially driven. We get into animal welfare some, but that's not. I don't see it as being a really top line issue. It's just kind of one of those. It's up in that, it's always there. But I think the environmental is definitely overtaking that quite a bit. So, the ability for consumer groups to engage, both through press and financially, and in political ways, writing everything from including writing petitions that are very that are taken very seriously, and in some cases are pretty strong, and then just the overall interest in what are different options, and putting that question into consumers' minds of, is what we're doing really what we should be doing today and for the future. So these are probably some of the greatest changes I've seen in the last few years. but veggie burger's been around for a
Yeah.
long time,
Yeah.
long time.
Yeah.
Well, a couple things come to mind. A few years ago, we had some family in our community moved in. We had them over for dinner, and I was barbecuing steaks, and they came and said, well, we're vegetarian. Oh no, so to defrost some tater tots, I didn't know what to do. But I put the steaks out, and they said, well, maybe we'll just try it a little bit. And they ate like every steak I could cook. So I recognize the various drives that we have as consumers to find satiety and enjoyment and stuff like that in food. I've spoken to this subject quite a bit over the last decade plus or minus, and so to some degree it's a mature topic. I guess just as a scientist, I'm more aware of how these there are various ways to look at things, right? There's math, right? There's chemistry that Jeff and I work with and stuff like that. And this subject, there's such a strong political feature to it, and that is it's something I'm not particularly skilled at, right? I mean, motivating people to do something because of statements or saying or otherwise, it's this realm has a strong undercurrent of that kind of momentum or influence behind it, and so I just I understand that more now than I did years ago, but that's certainly part of the formula as such. So indeed, there's science and math and chemistry and all the details that we speak about, but there's also a very strong political element that influences people's opinions and how we consider things. So I just have to throw that out. So.
One of my favorite speakers among our faculty is Dan Feynman, an atmospheric scientist. And he usually, at some point in a talk, he'll say, look, I didn't expect this to be my job. I didn't expect to be talking to the public about things. I like math. And I think that it's interesting to think about the way that you don't expect how the public comes to you sometimes, how society comes to you and brings an issue to your doorstep in a way that you never could have anticipated when you started your career. I'd love to open it to questions from the audience.
I'm curious about the insects. Yeah, I've heard about that, the trend of eating insects, or maybe the history of it in other countries more. And then I've read a couple articles about the rise of it in the US, but then also the dangers, because if you're out there foraging for insects to eat, they may have been treated with chemicals. So it would only be safe to consume them from a producer rather than just going out looking for stuff. But I really haven't seen any commercial insects for purchase in any grocery store. So I was just, that one took me aback. So I'd love to learn more about that.
I'm sure there's an aisle at Woodman's.
I did have cricket flour. Hy-Vee was carrying a product for a while. I don't know if they still do, but there's products like cricket flour, and certainly online.
And cricket protein bars,
Yeah.
I've seen
Yeah,
at
yeah.
the co-op, and I think maybe Woodman's. So I don't know. It's starting. It's not quite as advanced, I guess, a market, I would say, at least in appealing to the sort of Western market as plant-based protein products. But there's been a little bit of it.
Go on Amazon and all kinds of
Yeah.
insect products.
Yeah.
What was the what was the program? I forget what we called it.
Oh, Swarm to Table. We had a big program on campus.
Oh, yeah.
We had a big program on campus last March where Chef Joseph from Brooklyn Bugs came and did a whole banquet of insects. But more towards, I think, what you're questioning is this greater interest in the whole bug, like scorpions and crickets and mealworms, and Steph would certainly have a better perspective on, but that is definitely an area that's growing. I can't remember how many farms there are, licensed farms right now in the United States, but there's one in Minnesota for sure, I know that. But the movement is going more towards the whole insect or bug, and the whole field to fork, where it's produced. So I think,
Yeah.
and you're the expert on this, is there is the regulatory interest and emphasis now on what are the good agricultural practices for raising bugs and all that type of thing, so.
And what's complicated is that, so for many of our products, right, for sort of processed vegetable products, right, there's actually FDA regulations on the amount of insect parts that are in there, right? They're regarded as contaminants. So we have a lot of laws on the books about insects as contaminants, which makes it extra difficult, right, to regulate, to come up with safety things and sort of contamination kind of regulations for insects themselves when they've also been treated as contaminants. And also, arguably, other insects could be regarded as contaminants on certain types of insect products, right? So, if you have like one part, like it's sort of like get some kind of fried ants, but you have like 1 part fly or something per million, is that, the level of contaminant? That's the kind of thing that, I think the federal government will have to think of as there's more of these kinds of products on the market. However, I think the entrance of the federal government into providing sort of some kind of regulations on there is actually kind of welcomed by the insect industry because it legitimates it, right, as some kind of industry. Like they want to be able to say, right, this is FDA certified or something like that.
I'll be sticking with dairy.
Just
for the record.
Insects are not an approved ingredient for meat products, just to
Has insect protein gotten into feed at all? Or is it entered into the food chain anywhere else? Because I know there are different sorts of protein sources which can be components of. We have some animal feed experts in the audience I know as well.
That's what came up last week,
Yeah.
that it's entered into the feed supply as a starting point, and that's likely a more viable market, at least in the foreseeable future, yeah.
And we're kind of lagging behind Europe, I think, on this front, because the European Food Safety Authority did some kind of risk analysis of insects as feed products. So they're I think, ahead of the game in terms, compared to the U.S. in terms of evaluating some of the best practices there.
Yeah, I've got a question, I think is best directed to the 2 representatives from the Food Science Department. Regarding plant-derived beverages, sometimes called milk, number 1, what about their protein content in terms of an 8-ounce serving of cow's milk? Number 2, are the proteins in those products complete proteins with a full amino acid content? And then thirdly, what about the bioavailability of the calcium?
Is it 8 o'clock already? Yeah, I mean, so that's just the numbers, right? I mean, so indeed, if you look at so dairy milk is a very mature industry, and from a regulatory standpoint, also similarly mature with standards of identity and things like that. And those standards point towards things like the composition of the milk, and then but outside of that, in the plant-based beverages, I think to use your term, there are no such standards, and so I forget all the parameters you were seeking, but the level of protein swings dramatically. So you can have products that have, they're called milk, that have no protein. I'm just talking about gross numbers, to similar protein content to dairy, to animal milk. I think you asked about the amino acid, so it gets kind of the quality of the protein, and indeed that swings wildly as well. So milk proteins, especially whey proteins, are kind of a golden standard for evaluating proteins, the amino acid profile as well as their digestibility and things like that, the biological value and so forth. This is more Monica's realm than mine in terms of characterizing and their nutritional value. But again, plant proteins, the last presentation I gave on this subject, we found 32 or 33, can't remember, different plant-based milks.
Wow.
So it's hemp, it's coconut, it's soy, it's a long list of things. And so indeed, the protein, character is going to swing wildly. So and then I think you asked about calcium content as well, so the availability of the calcium. So milk is a unique food, and excuse me. What's interesting about milk is that the animal packages calcium, in a very unique way, and there's more calcium in milk than is soluble in that amount of water. And so what happens is the milk has more calcium that is really soluble, and so because of that, so there's various nutritional implications of that. So if you have water with dissolved salt in it, right? There's a very strong osmotic pressure, and it can cause intestinal upset and so forth. But if the salt's crystalline, and you don't digest it right away, then it's a very different animal, so to speak. And so that's why calcium in milk is, it's one of its advantages, and the way it's packaged really by the animal presented into the milk system is in the form of these very unique structures. And because of those structures, it's assimilated very slowly but very thoroughly. And so the other types of calcium, calcium citrate, calcium phosphate, calcium chloride, and so forth that are used to fortify milk. So if you have a plant-based milk and you fortify it, you're going to go to the periodic chart. You're going to hold calcium. Maybe you'll take some magnesium, and then you'll go to an ingredient supplier, and they have different forms of that salt, right? And so you'll add it into the product, and it does not really have the nutritional design behind how it's presented in that beverage as relative to how the mammal presented that calcium in milk.
As a nutritional delivery
right,
system.
so indeed, so it's not as readily assimilated, not as accessible by your body in terms of the calcium, and so the nutritionists, they speak often about the implications for I don't think of this vision of our refrigerator. I mean, my wife have 6 kids, and three boys still at home, and the fridge is half full with milk, right? Because they need a lot of athletic, they need a lot of nutrition, but the implications of that, for growing, children and so forth, or can be quite significant if you then compare it to another plant-based beverage or plant-based milks, so to speak, that where you kind of naively don't consider that it may not be nutritionally equivalent, right? So, or it may be nutritionally equivalent, right? For whatever reason you want to get away from dairy, you buy another type of milk, you use that on your cereal and drink it, and chocolate, whatever. But you be very careful about also making sure to provide your family with the right nutrition too. And in that case, it's you just have to be very thoughtful and careful about reading nutritional labels and so forth. Plant-based world is sort of all over the place. Dairy, it's very, very rigid in terms of what a dairy producer can call milk. So composition and all the, safety and quality and all that stuff. So that's kind of the challenge, right?
So then, as part of the argument that you're going to call plant-based milk, that they should meet similar rigorous standards in terms of composition?
I don't think that's the argument. I think the argument, obviously depending on which side, is that, and I'm sure you've seen this too, is who has the right to define foods, who owns the title to milk. And
right.
So it's, I don't know if I want to say it's more marketing.
Yeah.
But it's not, I haven't heard the argument that, again, it depends on which side, but on plant-based sides, everything's on the label, so read the label and you know what you're getting. Whereas, from the traditional sense, milk has a standard of identity, and we're held to it, so, yeah.
The notion that there is a strong association of milk with wholesomeness in parts of our culture. And that if you're attaching the word milk to something, you're kind of getting that boost.
Can I mention just one thing before getting to your question? Sorry. But it's complicated by sort of our First Amendment laws, because because for the government to compel speech, which that would mean requiring a certain kind of label, the government needs itself some kind of compelling kind of reason to sort of compel speech on the part of people, right? And since corporations are people as well, right, these kinds of protections apply to them, including to sort of plant-based food companies. So the government needs to demonstrate that there is something sufficient to be protected in it. Now the argument, right, would be that sort of consumer confusion about the nutritional element would have to rise to the level that they could compel kind of speech, but that's the kind of thing that makes it a difficult court kind of case, right? Whether or not that level of consumer confusion, either about the content, especially given that Monica says that the nutritional content is also on the label, does that rise to that level such that the government can actually compel speech, or should it be done in some other kind of way, right? By dialogue, by the sort of dairy industry to the public directly about the sort of competing kind of values of dairy-based products versus, you know, sort of plant-based products. So that's the the complicating legal factor to all this. Sorry.
It's probably important to acknowledge that all these debates about what counts are actually thousands of years old.
Yes.
We have a colleague who is a historian of Jewish food, who when he heard about this program, he was like, oh, is it about kosher laws? It's about debates of milk and meat? And I know that there are places where beer, what gets counted as beer, is very strictly regulated. So it sounds like a strange thing to put bounds around what counts as milk or meat or beer for that matter, but it's been going on for a long time.
But I was going to ask, is there anything that can't be labeled milk? Anything edible under current law? And that kind of reminded me of when the USDA got involved in establishing definitions for organic. So many farmers that are using methods that meet that standard and maybe are more rigorous even in terms of the notions of what people understood as organic before USDA came in and gave a definition, are not allowed to use that word anymore. I mean, and then it made me think also in terms of the book, the Poison Squad. I mean, is there anything to be learned from that saga in terms of how to of naming things, naming foods?
At this point in the U.S., there's, I mean, I could go to the chalkboard here, scrape off some of the chalk, put it in milk or water, call it Steve's milk.
You could, okay, that's what I think there's nothing that can't be called milk.
And then I don't think there's any means to prevent me from doing so.
Okay.
Calcium.
Yeah, that'd be calcium carbonate there, so not super bioavailability, but
I'm trying to understand.
The FDA started a regulation, a rulemaking process a few years, 2 years ago, something like that, but it never actually got to the end of it. They received a bunch of comments on this, and they weren't able to formulate some kind of actual regulation. At the same time, though, the Federal Trade Commission, because I study different agencies, the Federal Trade Commission is charged with false labeling claims. And so they can, although they haven't come up with a prescription for what milk entails. There has been cases litigating what milk can't entail, right?
Okay.
So if I took this and called it milk, right?
Yeah.
That would be something that could be individually adjudicated and that's the kind of thing that has been individually adjudicated. It's like this in no way falls under the definition of milk, right? Under any form of like conceptualization. What they haven't done is come up with a quote unquote definition, right? They determine things that aren't milk.
I guess my question was, I'm interested in this labeling regulation that you're talking about here because, you know, in the comment you just made, like who owns the word milk? But in the First Amendment, but shouldn't we have labeling laws or regulation that helps the consumer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
You
but
know, define what it is. I mean, you know, Scott just went through a great explanation of milk versus plant-based. And this is where I run into all this confusion with people. You talk about labeling laws getting more, am I correct understanding that labeling laws are getting more strict? Or you got
no, more that there's more state proposed laws
Okay.
to define what milk
Yeah.
is. That doesn't mean that labeling laws are getting more strict or anything, but it's just that this is the first appearance of laws trying to define what milk is.
Yeah, because what I've seen in the last 10 or 15 years is more confusion in the grocery store when you see you know, GMOs is a negative term.
Right.
Scientifically, it's pretty good technology, but it's very frowned upon. So, but you see labeling of GMO-free salt.
Right.
You gotta have DNA, and salt doesn't.
That
have to-
actually can be, that actually is illegal, the FTC has ruled on that, so you can't put a labeling claim on things that would never have a possibility of containing
Well, we,
that.
we see it
We
quite
do
a
it,
bit.
there's a lot of
Oh, yeah,
violations,
yeah,
but it is
yeah,
an actual
yeah.
legal
Yeah.
violation.
Enforcement.
So how long do you think it will take for those?
It would take someone to sue.
Yeah, but if they are doing these false acquisitions and giving people the punishments for it, do you think it's gonna be something that like comes to fruition on the Federal Trade Commission on their own, or is that something that like consumers are gonna have to report?
Probably depends on something consumers will have to report. I mean, there's a lot of violations that don't get enforced. For instance, most people are driving over 55 miles per hour in a 55 miles per hour zone, right? So enforcement is a different kind of thing than just whether or not it's allowed on the books. But technically, putting things like, you know, for instance, like dairy-free apple, right? That the FTC has said, no, that's, you know, misleading because it's implying that apples normally contain dairy, which they don't. Does that make sense?
You see a lot of gluten-free though.
Yes,
that
and those
are
are,
not gluten.
there's a lot of violations. There's a lot, I look around and I'm like, there's so many violations. But there's, you know, there's limited enforcement capacity because we're not funding the government.
But
Do you
there's
think
also a
it's-
lot of gluten contamination
Mhm.
in the food processing,
Yes.
so
Yeah.
sometimes you really need that gluten-free
Yeah,
labeling.
yeah, but gluten-free salt is very misleading.
Correct.
Do you think
Gluten-free water.
Right, yeah, exactly. Yes.
What about when non-fat dairy was introduced? Was there any question of whether that could be called dairy? I mean, like milk, you know, messing with it and taking out the.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where the kind of, the problem with confusion is that it's hard to gauge what you mean by confusion, because like, for instance, if you look at the historic use of the term milk, almond milk dates back to like the 1400 in French textbooks. It was referred to specifically as milk. So, and, you know, so milk has been alternately used to mean dairy products and to mean, you know, nut-based products throughout the course of history. So are people being confused about that? Are they really being confused about the nutrition? Is that contained in the nutrition label? These are all the kinds of things, I'm not weighing in that it should be one way or the other, but these are the kinds of things that, of course, we'll need to address in dealing with the First Amendment challenges.
If I'm not mistaken, people did used to say nut meats
Yeah,
as well.
yeah, they did, yeah.
So-
Yeah. So in the title, who gets to decide? Would you say that it's driven by industry, consumers, government, all of the above? What's the force?
I'm an all-of-the-above kind of person. I mean, I just like to watch the mess unfold. Honestly, that's what I'm here for.
I would argue that it's all of the above, and I think there's certainly been a number of examples lately where consumer force has made a difference. Certainly, the very first book of the Go Big Read was In Defense of Food by Michael Pollan, and it's so interesting to me because I can ask students today, how do some consumers define what a healthy food is, and they'll say less than 5 ingredients, and I'll say, where did that come from? No idea. I'll ask them, do you know who Michael Pollan is? Blank face, blank face. But that message stuck, and a lot of consumers acted on that. So I think there's, I would argue that all three, depending on first of all, what the issue actually is. And then consumers do make a difference. But certainly, I can't argue that government and industry does as well. So I would say all of the above.
I mean, my own myopic perception and teaching the regulations that apply to the food and dairy foods industry is that the regulations are a function of a political action, not necessarily sound science. So in that realm, it becomes very difficult to sort of, you know, say that it's solely a function of the best science that we, you know, just generated, or it's, you know, that sort of thing. So it's complicated. So.
And often, you may have multiple people, sometimes with conflicting perspectives, all claiming that their science is sound science as well. So even the question of what counts as sound science there's room for regulation there.
Yeah.
Well, what I think is interesting too is the ways in which laws shape the food that comes out, right? You were talking about the sort of standards of identity for milk. Part of the reason why we get a uniform container of dairy milk is because there are them, but what that means is that milk gets mixed and stuff like that to reach the same level of consistency. The same thing about like if you're making beer and stuff like that, or especially making liquor, right? You know, you see the difference between cask strength, which can vary depending on the cask of like Scotch versus like the kind of ones that are trying to reach a level of consistency. So these regulations, these laws also shape what ends up at the end point of the consumer. And if one were to adopt different standards of identity for sort of nut-based milks, right, that would shape how they're produced. So it goes in multiple directions, I would say, not just shaping the meaning of food, but shaping what food comes out of the whole system.
Yeah, and I don't, this is maybe a comment and a question to add, but for, you know, meat labeling realm, regulations, those driven for labeling, probably seem to be harder to change, modify, or add than they used to be. And you know, we find, or I find, or the industry finds that, you know, sometimes we get caught in the regulations are intended for preventing confusion, but they do quite the opposite when the initial intent of the labeling, for example, is surpassed by the opportunity, or by technologies and science and markets that didn't exist or were never thought of when those initial, you know, labeling standards were produced. So, you know, probably the most well-known in the meat industry as of the past decade or so has been uncured meat products that most of them are cured, but you know, it's
Because they didn't fall under the
facsimile. If there's
standard.
no labeling standard that
Yeah.
exists, so the only one that can be used is one that isn't accurate, which was really intended to describe products which that were produced to prevent confusion, which now are being used to creating a lot of confusion.
So cured
Absolutely.
meats are now, or uncured meats are labeled following the same rules as cured meats, is that what you're saying?
No, so.
See, I'm already confused.
Yeah, right. So maybe 15 years ago or so, when there was when technology was advanced enough to create products that are cured using natural sources of nitrite, natural curing ingredients, namely celery powder or vegetable powders that have that natural high occurring concentrations of those ingredients. So when those products were starting to be produced, resulting in a natural form of curing, scientifically they are cured if you analyze for nitrite in the compounds, which are nitrosamine, which is a cured pigment. But labeling doesn't allow those products to be manufactured because they're not recognized on an ingredient deck as sodium nitrite. So they have to fall under uncured labeling because that's the only other avenue. They're either cured or they're uncured. Cured is defined as sodium nitrite being on the label. Uncured is everything else.
There's a lot of unintended consequences.
Absolutely.
When a label gets out there, maybe it's adequate for the stuff which exists at the time,
Right.
but then new stuff comes in,
Right.
and you have to make decisions about whether that counts. I imagine this is coming up with new technologies of lab cultivated meat.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. That's exactly one of the arguments that comes up, that technology is advancing so quickly that the old regulations just don't make sense.
Yeah.
Just a question really about what Steph said, but I'm thinking specifically about the industry in that, so if the regulation is now driving what consumers receive, then doesn't that kind of create a situation where we as consumers now don't have a lot of choice? So you've got growers and producers who have to meet a legal regulation, and doesn't that have an impact on, say, the size of producers or what folks even feel like they can produce? Now you're growing or producing to meet a regulation as opposed to consumer need.
Yeah, I mean, that comes up in the organic kind of labeling all the
Yeah.
time in terms of before it became adopted in federal regulation, like there was, right, definitely the concern, right, before that many people were calling themselves organic and they weren't really meeting any standard.
Right.
But once it became federalized, everyone was meeting the same standard and not necessarily going above and beyond. So there's a whole debate about that that's kind of
Yeah.
fascinating,
Yeah.
like which way the sort of push and pull is.
Yeah.
Well, and the people then that can't meet the organic
Right, then they're stuck
process,
out
but
of
they
it.
are organic.
Yeah, because they can't pay for certifiers and stuff, but that's why there's some exceptions for small scale producers, but it gets complicated, and so, yeah, I mean, I think there's always pros and cons to sort of regulating, I think it's complicated.
There's a hand in the middle here, yeah.
So my question was about environmental impacts, and Monica, especially for you, when people are talking about environmental impacts, are they looking at the environmental impacts, say, of these plant-based meats, which don't see the light of day and require, you know, energy to be created, and are basically forms of food that are not found necessarily in nature? They're all highly processed foods. So is that something that you are seeing from the consumer side as well, that people are concerned about that particular environmental impact?
I'm definitely seeing and hearing that, and I think like many of these issues that we've addressed already this evening, we don't know, but there's certain foods that have a sort of this halo effect. Like many of the people I talk to automatically assume that plant-based processed food is better for the environment. I'm not sure we know. I would have a hard time citing absolute evidence because I don't know yet. Okay, but I think there's a lot of that and that's what I mentioned early on, is I'm just fascinated by perception when we don't necessarily know the full reality yet. So
Yeah.
It's like you're not measuring yet the external cost of processing or producing.
Right. What are the
Plant
external?
based negative, like
I'm
analysis.
sure Jeff and Scott have a better perspective, but, shoot, where was I going with this? So I think what gets in the press, or what people hear, is that for every pound of beef produced, X number of gallons of water is used, and that's like, that just gets out there.
Or
But-
methane. I mean, the
Right,
thing now is methane,
yeah,
methane,
so
methane. Cows
what
are
I,
methane
what I
producers.
don't have a good grasp of yet is what's the whole picture of what it took to produce each item. That, you know, we tend to get into these single factor issues and then sort of, and this is just speculation on my part, this is something I'm trying to learn about, is I think there's some sort of knee-jerk reaction to, I'm gonna buy this over that because of X number of gallons of water or something like that. But, and organic is a good example. Like, I don't know very many people that can cite the definition of organic. But if I go into rooms and say, how many of you buy organics, the vast majority of hands go up. So that's something that I'm really fascinated by, is what do we really know versus how do we really behave?
Yeah, there is a standardized life cycle assessment
Yeah.
when looking at, greenhouse gases
Yeah.
produced. And there's some incomplete life cycle assessments and there's complete life cycle assessments. And the big example is 2006 when they came out and said cattle were worse for greenhouse gases than cars. They only measured the tailpipe emissions of the cars. They didn't go into all the energy that was expended in making the cars, bringing the oil over and stuff like that versus the greenhouse gas emissions of animals. They did everything, a total life cycle assessment. And this gets confusing for people, and I can understand that. And I guess with the methane, what I would suggest, when people ask me, geez, cattle are bad, and I says, well, yes, they do produce methane. Our business is not going to deny that. They produce methane. We're more efficient than we've ever been. But what I always would say is during the pre-industrial era in this country, there was 90 million or 80 million or 70 million buffalo roaming the ranges, producing a lot of methane. And global warming did not start then. Okay? So it's part of it, but until our society wants to blame everything else, farmers, since they're only 2% of the population, are easy to target.
Well, I think that there's a quality of people trying to do the right thing This is interesting because I didn't expect this conversation to touch on my expertise, which is public engagement with science. And one of the things that you get into very quickly in territories of public engagement with science is people get angry with each other very fast. They get angry with each other about vaccines, they get angry with each other about diets, they get angry with each other about a lot of things. And this particular case of what I see when I think about this is consumers who have 6 kids or 2 kids or just very busy lives trying to do the best they can to make good choices and without the time to dig into the complexity. And that's where ideally you would hope that some clarity in labeling or regulation or some clearly available information would help you.
That's my point trying to get to is this labeling should be for the benefit of the consumers versus.
And yet, as we're seeing, I think that the labeling is complicated and has unintended consequences. And that it's hard to, if you think about environmental impacts, things like displacement. You know, if you're using land to graze cattle or grow soy, what is that land not being used for? What was it being used for before? And all that stuff can affect environmental benefits and harms as well. Other questions? Perhaps in the back. We've had a quiet back room. Maybe that's why you're all in the back. Yes, please.
So, labeling is hard to change. Regulatory has its own issues. But it could be regulated more fairly, like with dairy milk and all the non-dairy milks. They're all on the same darn shelf, all intermixed with everything these days. Why do I have to have A and B requirements in milk, or half and half that has to meet a standard of identity, and if it doesn't meet it, I can't make it? But all of these other non-dairy milks, it seems like they have no regulation. So why can't there be more of a push to regulate? If everybody's pretending to be milk, why can't we regulate them more like milk?
And they absolutely could. I mean, that's
But they don't.
They don't,
Why
right?
don't they?
Well, I mean, because, why don't they is a question of like sort of agency resources and stuff like that. Has there been a push to do that? Right, if you look at the sort of, say, office of the FDA and stuff like that, compared to how much it's doing, it's not that many people there, right, to do that, huh? And
Yeah, I'm sure.
they're working on a lot of different things, and so the things that come to their attention are usually the things where there has been a public outcry. They're more of a responsive agency than a proactive agency. And so if consumers were to demand it, which I have to think consumers probably should, you know, that would be something to put it on their radar. But it has to sort of, they're really just more a reactive agency because of resource constraints.
One thing which is interesting about what about this question versus the bugs question is that I heard you all say earlier that the bug industry is really anxious for regulation, and they're asking for it because regulation for them is key to being seen as a viable food product.
Yeah.
Whereas other sectors may feel like they're happy with the amount of regulation they have, and they don't really want more.
Yeah,
I think
it's
that probably
fascinating.
defines a lot of producing sectors. Yes.
It just makes me curious if there's been any discussion about changing regulation or loosening regulation around dairy milk instead of enforcing regulation around
Raw milk.
Just mostly raw milk, yeah.
Yep.
And there's a lot of discussion about that.
Yeah.
There often is.
Yeah, the platform of the typical lobbying groups for dairy foods industries, trade associations and things like that have really been to push the FDA to enforce the rules that they already have. And meaning to enforce the term and definition of milk, and like Canada, many European countries do and so forth. That's been their position, not necessarily. I haven't seen anything that's any movement where they're, you know, well, if you're not going to regulate them, why regulate us? I haven't seen that.
I wonder if there's a case where, I imagine there is, where producers have sort of collectively decided on a standard. Have there been standards or definitions that have come sort of more bottom up from producers or people who, dairy producers deciding what?
Organic is the history of that,
Organic is
because it was
history.
bottom up. And people were following these sort of principles, and then it was followed in inconsistent manners from state to state, and some states adopted regulations, and it just got so confusing, so that's how we ended up having a federalized system. But that started up on a sort of...
I got a question for Steph. So obviously we live in a big dairy state,
Yeah.
right? So you think there's any possibility, yay or nay, that they will ever be able to label dairy milk as only milk, and then all the other products will not get labeled as milk, because I don't see the dairy industry wanting to call their product almonds.
Right, no.
You know, but they're piggybacking on the wholesome thing of milk. You know, to
Yeah.
me, that confuses consumers.
I think it's
Does
going
it?
to, well, it confuses well, there's one way that it does in terms of nutrition, but then there's one way that it doesn't in terms of what you use it for. So people use it to sort of pour onto cereal and stuff like that. So every single food term has different signifiers to it. One is it signifies healthiness. I actually go into this in my paper. Another has a history of signifying things like, you know, robustness and like, you know, strength in growing up. It has lots of different types of meaning, and it can be confusing according to some meanings and not confusing according to others. And that's the thing that I think courts will have to wrestle with when they deal with these First Amendment challenges, and that's mostly what I'm focused on. Is
You know,
that.
I'm not against it all as far as almond drinks and all that
Yeah.
different kind of stuff. But if you look at the nutritional profile side by side, there's a big difference.
Right, but it
The
depends.
point over here
Yeah.
is that we're trying to help consumers decide, and families who are always on the go, got 6 kids or whatever, trying to help you make good decisions.
And my point is just that that's the aspect that courts will have to decide if that's compelling enough reason
We're gonna leave it
to
to
Whether the
restrict.
label is sufficient,
Is it-
is the
yeah.
argument.
Because
of
if they say that that is not needed because there's already the nutritional content in the label, then, you know, the courts tend to be hesitant to allow governments to restrict First Amendment rights. And that's where these challenges are likely going to come
Which most of the time
I
is
don't know
something
how
you
else-
want,
yeah.
right?
Right, yeah.
So it's an interesting, yeah, Rita.
But is there anything to say about when non-fat milk came into being? And whether there was question of whether that's milk, because that's changing the profile of it.
Oh, right, no, there wasn't really.
When did non-fat?
It's been forever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, our lifetime.
Separates naturally, and we used to eat the cream and feed the skim milk to the pigs. That's how it was used, you know, historically at the home level and so forth. But there have been
But
some
what was
changes to
marketed-
the standards of identity for milk, for instance.
Yeah, that's what I
Other
meant.
words have entered in, things like, you know, remember the term light in foods? You know, like light tortilla chips. And then, you know, so there have been some words that have popped up that have driven refined definitions under the Labeling Education Acts and things like that. So there have been some revisions to the regulations that influence milk, including the definitions around what, there was a movement at one time to not call it skim milk, you know, to call it non-fat milk. And so there have been some movement around those, but you go in the Code of Federal Regulations and you'll see skim milk and it'll have some definition about it in terms of its composition.
And I also just wanted to compare this with Europe, because I mentioned the First Amendment because it's relevant here, but it's not really relevant in Europe. They don't have that same type of free speech protections for corporations, and so they've actually just said milk, only dairy and rice for some reason, because there's a history of rice milks, I guess, in France. Even though there's a history of almond milk in France, for some reason the history of rice milk was more important. So they said, yes, these two, dairy, milk, and everyone doesn't get to use it. Because there's not that same protection. So comparatively, it's very different around the world too. So, and this is still coming up in different places. Yeah.
This gentleman here.
Yeah. I think this is a question for Monica. Over the past decade or so, we've seen science start to better understand the importance of the human gut biome, human bacteria, as a function of overall wellness. And one of the functions of the gut bacteria is that they recognize novel proteins as allergens and sometimes reject them. So, this may be an unanswerable question, but if lab-cultured meats are produced using genetically modified organisms and then with their energy source as high fructose corn syrup, who's to say that these proteins are not going to be recognized by the gut biomes of some folks as allergens?
Yeah, you're right, I don't know the answer, but it's certainly part of the discussion. There was a huge article in Slate just in the last couple of weeks, I think, and all of those, that whole laundry list of what ifs, what ifs, what ifs. So and I'm sure Jeff has a much better perspective on this, but that whole, the lab cultured meat is a whole nother arena that is raising some of these very same questions. But those issues have been raised, but I certainly don't know what
Has anyone tried to market lab-grown meat as a supplement instead of a food? So
They get out of the FDA.
Yeah. The FDA
Well,
doesn't regulate
yeah.
everything, it regulates some things.
Yeah.
But
CBD infused.
no doubt.
Sorry, when you said that.
We could have a whole nother hill about that.
No, when you said that, I was thinking in a totally different direction, which is like the traditional Chinese medicine and how Chinese people have been eating all these endangered species, and if you could just lab grow that meat,
Right.
maybe
Lab-grown
they wouldn't be importing all these things.
Yes, in the back.
Are there any thoughts that perhaps the standard of identity rules, which seem antiquated or from the 30s, have outlived their usefulness?
The
And they're in-
FDA, I'm sorry.
And they're in competition in many ways with free speech, and that there's fair labeling laws now that help people understand nutrition, labeling, and all that?
That actually is one of the arguments right now is, fairly recently, the FDA proposed what I think they referred to as their strategic innovation something.
Yeah, something like that.
Where, and part of that strategic plan was to review the standards of identity, exactly for that purpose, that they're antiquated. It
So
is
what
the
are, sorry,
argument.
what are the standards of identity for those who don't know?
Standards of identity are federally defined definitions of foods by composition.
Okay, got it.
So, yeah. But that, as far as I know, that FDA strategic plan to review standards of identity is stalled right now, but that question.
Weren't they taking comments still? I thought they were.
Are they taking
I don't
comments
know,
on
but I
that?
think they
Yeah,
were.
but anyway, yeah, that is definitely in the hopper, as do standards of identity even make sense anymore? That's a question that comes up quite a bit. Does it even make sense to have them at all?
And can I redirect a little bit to Dr. Rankin? So many of the standard of identities are about dairy. Is there any thoughts from a dairy perspective that this protects the industry or it hinders the industry?
I think federally, there's not a lot of political energy to influence the federal standards of identity. Here in Wisconsin, in the dairy state, we adopt federal rules, but we also work to refine state regulations, and those tend to be more responsive. So, for instance, the standard identity of milk. When I arrived in Madison in 2001, it read milk. I wouldn't quote it exactly, but it says milk is the lacteal secretion obtained from the milking or one or more healthy cows. And then it changed to cows and goats, and it said cows, goats, and sheep. And then they punned it and said hoofed animals. It also included the term fresh, and the fresh lacteal secretion. And then but if you have UHT milk, it's shelf life of 6 months. And that your idea of fresh, So that term disappeared, and then there was another recent change. So I guess your question is, are they antiquated? Yes, especially at the federal level. I would say that's very clear. They're from the 50s in some cases, the regulations that we deal with that we all kind of groan about. Oh yeah, but there's just not a lot of political energy when the latest salmonella crisis or whatever is really occupying much of their bandwidth. But I think in Wisconsin, at least for dairy, we're probably a little bit more progressive and a little bit more proactive in this regard. And if I look at it and I say, are they trying to be protective of the dairy industry? I would say no. I think they're just trying to be realistic and responsive. So here's another example. That definition includes the phrase practically free from colostrum. So milk, blah, 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 legally practically free of colostrum, which was the first secretion, and when a mammal gives birth, they have this material. It's not quite milk, but it's filled with all these antibiotics, these antibodies rather that are immunoglobulins that are intended to confer some health benefits, some immune benefits to the offspring. And so guess what? If someone think, well, wait a minute, so we can take colostrum now and then package that up and sell it as a supplement, and but it's coming from the same cow that 3 days later is giving milk, and so they also counted for that because they don't want they don't want salmonella. They don't want colostrum in some gel tablets at the local farmers market full of salmonella kind of a thing, right? So I think in Wisconsin we're probably a little bit more responsive to just making sure. So DAC Caps, our Department of Ag, they're highly regarded people. I have high regard for them and their work and their expertise and understanding. I don't say that for every state, and I don't think the federal government is quite as up to date. I think for thoughts that were shared earlier about they just don't have the political energy and so forth, or the bandwidth to make those changes.
I was thinking when you're talking about the food, like honey, and we went around with that for a while. What is honey?
I wasn't even aware of that.
Can you add? Well, some people are adding maybe corn syrup, and so how much can you add and still call it honey?
Like breakfast syrup versus maple syrup.
Well, there are regulations in that general area. There are regulations like that we all agree. Yeah, we don't want half corn syrup and honey, but it's very difficult to assay for that. And so in many cases it was like a regulation, but it was unenforceable because there's no tool that we could routinely use to enforce it. To call this is out of spec or otherwise. So talk to the bees, or spend like $2 million running every assay to, that sort of thing. So that was the problem in that case, and it's not uncommon in enforcing food regulations. A good idea, it's on the books, but the reality is there's no way to enforce it.
It's sort of like that expose when people DNA tested all the sushi at sushi restaurants and it's not actually the fish. I mean that's a legal violation, but how do you actually enforce that? The police force is not going around testing.
Honey is actually one of a very common fraudulent products. Honey is olive oils and fish. Just as you're not sure if that's Chilean sea bass on the menu.
Didn't used to be called Chilean sea bass.
Yeah.
That's a whole other question.
Yeah.
Naming a fish. Yeah.
In that realm, though, here's an example where that I think it's wise for the FDA to be more so perhaps take a more aggressive stance in that. So in the 2000s, there was a couple of processors in China that were adding melamine to dairy ingredients, and in so doing we were fortifying the milk to test as if it were higher in protein than it was originally. And melamine, if you go back and you look at melamine, it's actually, there are patents on melamine about being a good food source, good source of nutrition, good in, so is that wrong? So of course, I think 130,000 people were were exposed to this and had issues, and several kidney problems resulted in some deaths and so forth. And so it was a very tragic thing. But and I spoke in China, in fact in Beijing, right after that, and to all these Chinese dairy producers, and they and the thing that I mentioned to them, if that were to happen in the U.S., before any of the big regulatory entities could mobilize towards this, before any of that would happen, CNN would have been there first. And that's a huge influence on what, how things operate, and it just goes to my point about how political these things become, and so but it's a good example of where, so you asked, could anything be labeled milk? And yeah, I don't think there's anything. You're getting some water and chalk dust and calling it milk, and so that's where I think we run into trouble, right, with these sort of things that they're not, kind of vetted through what we regard as our strong, sort of regulatory and entities that are charged with making sure the food supply is safe and wholesome and all that jazz.
Can I just make a distinction here? There's an interesting thing going on. A lot of what we've been talking about is labeling, which is claims to having certain kinds of contents and so forth. I think the standards of identity issue is really interesting, particularly for meat, because tissue engineered meat is done in various different kinds of ways. So what is defined as meat? Is it myocytes plus fat plus other, I mean, how is, and what fascinates me, and this is for Steph and maybe Jeff as well, from that perspective, from standards of identity, how can there be state-to-state variances in defining what meat is if you're going to have regulatory agencies like the FDA, but also USDA or other groups that might be regulating processing, bioprocessing. So how do those things interdigitate from the state level to the federal level?
I think it's going to be complicated. So the FDA and the USDA actually sort of signed a memorandum of understanding between each other about which side they're going to regulate. So the USDA is going to regulate, I think, the sort of growing of it in the vats and stuff like that. And so further processing, I think, like some of the sort of layering of like fat, fat layers and stuff, all that stuff I think is going to the FDA. I might be getting it slightly confused, and you guys should correct me if I'm wrong. But basically they've decided which parts they're going to start to tackle. And when they start issuing those safety regulations, they will probably tackle, my guess is, some issues with standards of identity, but maybe not. But what they've done in the past with sort of novel foods is they've also sort of promulgated these best practices for states. And so the FDA and the
So
USDA.
it's like a recommendation.
Yeah, recommendation. And they've done that for a lot of other kinds of areas where states sometimes just adopt the FDA recommendation straight up, or the USDA, depending on what it is. Sometimes it's with some kind of modifications, but there's I suddenly can't remember the name of the word for it, but there's basically a thing that the feds try to come up with to try and give some kind of
There's
guidance.
a difference in guidelines and best practices.
Yeah.
In dairy, we call it, so in dairy there's a big one we refer to as a model law,
That's
ordinance.
it. Yeah.
Model ordinance.
So Jeff, if that grown tissue were regulated as meat, would that then become part of your portfolio?
It would, because as Steph alluded to, so the agreement has been signed, and specifics are being worked out, or most of them are the big ones, that FDA will manage, basically the embryonic stem cells, the banking, the growth, harvest and growth, and then USDA will regulate when the growing becomes enough to basically create meat, and then they'll take over from labeling, from a food safety, from a standard identity standpoint. So yes, it would eventually will fall under the auspice of meat.
Are producers today thinking a lot, like beef producers today in Wisconsin, thinking a lot about that? Thinking about the advent of lab-grown meat?
Yeah, I think, so definitely conversations, everyone's aware of it. It's been in the works for 20 years now. Mark Post was the person who has really been working on it for much of his career. It's only been until the last few years where there's been a surgence of interest. So companies such as the Gates Foundation and others have really fostered startup companies, and there's been a couple of the big ones, and then because of the opportunity, so the exposure and interest, right, and then because of the opportunity, many of the very large meat industry companies have invested in some of those companies, and have remained invested, in terms of essentially millions of dollars. Tyson has been the first to pull out to say, hey, we've done our evaluation. It's probably not something that's a good investment for us at this point in time, but I think the general assessment general view is that it's so far out that, at some point in time, it will become a better topic to work through. Right now, it's at a point, it's still in its infancy, which everybody even in the cultured meat world would acknowledge that it's still quite a ways out. So understanding the science and FDA and USDA have done a good job of getting in front of this and saying, okay, we know that this is going to be part of the making of food in the future. Let's draft language in terms of how we're going to regulate the various aspects of the process. I don't know what the cost of a cultured base hamburger is now. It's still a few $100,000. But right, science,
ketchup, pretty good.
Ketchup. Science and technology and time we'll see that number go down quite a bit and volume increase. So.
Well, but, if I can just add a little bit, one of the things that's so expensive is the cell culture itself, because of the components that have to go in there. But if the FDA is handling that part of the cell part, they're gonna base it on human ES cells, which they've been regulating for some time, so there may be this, existing infrastructure about the way of thinking about cell culture from the human use perspective, which is going to ramp up the requirements quite a bit, my guess.
Makes those insects sound pretty good.
We're talking about control.
There's.
Well, sorry, yes, in the back.
My question is, where is the state of Wisconsin as far as legislation? Are they still trying to develop words? Are they getting any input from both sides? What's happening with ACLU? Are they keeping track of the states? So I guess that's more for Stephanie.
Oh, yeah, so we have a piece of legislation that deals with meats and sort of calling it both we're different from the other states in that it allows for insect-based meats to be also called meats for some reason. None of the other states have that legislation in there. But we have a piece of legislation for that. We have a piece of legislation for dairy, and they include terms like, saying, meats and meat-based words like burgers, etc. Dairy and dairy-based words. So we're sort of one of the newer states, I think maybe the 12th or 11th state, to have legislation like that. And has the ACLU weighed in? Not really, but they might do so eventually. I don't know. But that's where we're at. Just if you're interested, these state laws vary a lot, and they're kind of fascinating. Some of them are just about meat, and a lot of them don't have dairy in there. Some of them do. Some of them include meat-based terms like burger states, and they'll list specific terms. Some of them will specifically do other things. Arkansas is weird that they're not regulating dairy, but they are regulating rice to restrict the use of rice from being claimed by cauliflower rice. So that's just a random thing. So there's a lot of variations that are around. Really, meat equals livestock plus insect state.
In the question, you're talking about how you're defining the different products?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
With the terminology too, the rice, that was something new for me, but I think about terminology, are they also going to clarify products that are maybe dairy and meat? I mean, is milk going to be called cow's milk? And will things like hot dogs be labeled no dogs? Really, think about that. And hamburger, I mean, is
How
there
many accidental dogs?
Is there hamburger? I mean, are people really confused about this? So it kind of goes back to, I think, the standard of, what was the term?
Standards of identity.
Standard of identity. And are they going to change the terminology away from hot dogs so people
It's
aren't
called a
confused?
common emulsified meat product.
Are these changes going to go both ways with meat products, meat alternatives?
Not the legislation so far.
Have you heard of the merit?
The merit?
The merit, M-A-R-R-O-T. Have you heard of the merit? Oh, somebody Google that.
Yeah.
It was a spoof. I think it was Arby's. It's a meat-shaped carrot.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So,
You mean carrot made of meat?
Yeah.
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 Oh, the merit, I see.
Yeah, a merit, yeah.
Monica, you have Deborah's book there, and I'm wondering, is, from the perspective of someone who knows a lot about this already, what do you think that book might be of particular interest, might add to this, the conversation that we're having? I think that some folks here might be interested in reading it.
I'll be honest, when the chancellor first selected this book, I was like, really? And then I did read it cover to cover, and I was very impressed with it. From my perspective, some of the best takeaways are how some things have not changed at all in terms of like all of the issues, like all of the language and just the arguments at that time about specific words, just like we're having tonight. You know, that's what struck me the most, is how the more I got into this book and all the way to the end, it's like, it's just like this today, it's just like this today. And I would say, and at another presentation, they said the danger of food, or the fraud of food is, it's more subtle. It's not, I mean, they were putting some really awful things in food. But what struck me more than anything is just the laundry list of things that, social, economic, and political forces that are still in place today and have such an impact on our food supply today.
So we tend to think about these problems as being really contemporary, but in fact, they've been around for a long time.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
So we're coming up against the end of time. One last question there?
Just a comment. I don't know if it was just organic or somebody from the USDA who came out with the motto, "Know your farmer." Maybe that's really where we need to get to. Then we know where your food's coming from.
I think that was a USDA.
What?
I think it was USDA.
In general, yeah. So maybe becoming full circle to that.
So the library is closing in about 5 minutes.
Oh.
So
we're going to call it quits. And if you all could join me in thanking our wonderful